All right. Well, we've got Mike Licona here, and I'm thankful for him coming to be interviewed. I definitely appreciate that. He's done many things about the resurrection of Christ, and that's, of course, absolutely crucial to Christianity. So thank you very much, Dr. Licona, for coming on. And can you tell us a little bit about your background? How did you become a Christian? Where did you receive your education? Where have you taught in the past? Where are you teaching now? All that kind of thing.
Yeah, sure. Well, I became a Christian at the age of 10. I can remember when I was about 8 years old, walking to church with my mom, and I asked her one Sunday, "So how do I get to heaven?" And she said, "Well, you just have to do more good than bad." And I said, "Well, what if I'd hit my sister, pulled her hair, made her cry." I said, "What if I did do more than bad than good?" And she said, "Well, then you go to hell to be with the devil forever." And I'm thinking, where am I on that scale? Um, So when I was 10 years old, I was at church and they brought in this Christian magician and he would do these magic tricks and he would relate the gospel to it. And it was like the first time I had heard it's not anything that we do that gets us eternal life. It's what Christ did for us. And so it was a Presbyterian church, but the guy gave an invitation, and I thought, wow, this is exactly what I've been looking for. I finally have heard the message on how I can have a relationship with God. And so I went forward. I remember it was me and two other girls, and I'm thinking, well, I don't know why everybody's not coming forward, but I don't care. This is what I'm looking for. So that's the day I considered that I met the Lord. Now, of course, my epistemological processes weren't really fully developed at age 10. So later on, I began questioning my faith and looked for evidence. And that's when I got introduced to Christian apologetics and just have loved it. Just trying to look at the evidence. And more recent years, have focused on historical evidence. I want to know what we can show with pretty good confidence about Jesus to see what historical inquiry can yield about that. So I love it, and that's how I got involved in what I'm doing now.
Okay, great. And where do you teach now? And it would definitely be impressive if, as a 10-year-old, you were talking about epistemological foundations. So we may not be
Yeah.
surprised that you were not doing that at the time.
Well,
But
no, I didn't use that term at the time. I'm just saying, now looking back at, but I teach at
right.
Houston Christian University.
Okay, okay, great. Can you tell us a little bit about the debates you've done?
Yeah, so I've had, I believe it's 38 debates now, public debates I've had. And, I can remember in the late 1990s, I was introduced to some audio cassette tapes of William Lane Craig. One, he was debating Frank Zindler, and the other, he was debating John Dominic Crossan. And I can remember just listening to those debates over and over. I must have listened to each of those debates 30 times. And
Wow.
I was just so, wow, I was just so impressed with him and how he could just brilliantly answer these objections and the arguments these guys are bringing up. And I thought, wow, I would just love to do that, but I'll never be able to do that. I mean, I truly thought I'd never be able to do that. And maybe some skeptics out there who have watched my debates will say, yeah, and he has never been able to do that. but um, but yeah, I never thought I'd be able to. And then in uh, 2002, or maybe the beginning of 2003, Gary Habermas called me and said, "Hey, Mike, I mean, I was just starting my doctorate or about to start my doctorate." And he said, "Hey, Mike, I've been contacted by Dan Barker's organization, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and they asked if I'd be willing to debate at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And I don't," he says, "Mike, I don't like to debate, but you had expressed an interest in it at some point in the past. Would this be something you'd be interested in doing?" And I said, "Well, do you think I could win? I mean, I don't have any experience with the stuff." He said, "Well, Barker is not a scholar, and you know the resurrection argument pretty well. That's what the debate's about. So it'd be a good first one for you to try to see if you like it." So I accepted it, and I really enjoyed it. The organization that invited Barker, uh, atheist organization, had told the Christian organization, which I think was Crew, um, that they thought I won the debate, and it's like, well, I thought I did too. So the next year they asked Gary for two more, one with Shabir Ali and one with Richard Carrier, and he said,
Hmm.
Mike, I don't want to do them. Would you like to do them? I said, sure. So
Hmm.
I started preparing, and I really prepared for them, probably 70 plus hours every week for three to
Hmm.
4 months, and I enjoyed those as well. Um, Nabil Qureshi was at the Shabir Ali one. He was a Muslim at the time, and he said he thought I won hands down in that. And that was really instrumental. One of the main things that was instrumental to him coming to faith.
Hmm.
So yeah, I just kind of liked it, and so I've just continued to do it over the years. So let's see, my first debate was in spring of 2003. So it's been about 23 years I've been doing it now, and I just really enjoy it.
Sure,
But I
sure.
don't know how much more I'm going to do. I've kind of debated everyone I've wanted to. Um, so yeah, I don't know how many more I'll do, but it's been a fun journey, and it's
Sure,
been very
sure.
fruitful. People have told me how it's encouraged their faith. Some have come back to faith as a result. Like my second debate with Richard Carrier, a girl came up to me. She was a junior, came up to me afterwards, said she had left the faith, her Christian faith, her first year in school, and now her third year in school. She just came to watch the debate tonight out of entertainment, but didn't know there was evidence for the resurrection. She was now
Hmm.
coming back to faith.
Hmm. Well,
So
that's
I've had
great.
that kind of stuff happen. I've had people say they're devoting themselves to full-time Christian ministry as a result. So those debates, they've been quite fruitful. I just had a guy yesterday. I was in a restaurant, and he came up to me and said, "Are you Mike Licona?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "I thought you were. I didn't know you lived in this area, and I watch your debates, and I read your stuff, and man, they've been so encouraging." So it's like, that's cool.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I actually we lived in Wisconsin for quite a while. My wife's dad is a pastor there, and I got to debate. Um, uh, I'm thinking about Barter, not Barter, the guy that you debated first, Barker. Definite different quality between Barker and Ehrman. But yeah, I got to
Yeah,
debate him
yeah.
twice too, and I would agree with Habermas's assessment that he offered there. Definitely, some of the other people he mentioned are more serious in their arguments that they make, but definitely it's a blessing to be able to get truth out. And I could tell, like you mentioned, all the preparation you were doing. Like I watched your recent debate with Urban over the authorship of the Gospels with interest, and I can tell you definitely take these seriously. You do prepare seriously, and that's really commendable that you actually seriously prepare for you debate. God does deserve excellence in what we do. I thought you made a strong case for the traditional authorship of the Gospels, though of course I am biased in favor of that view as a Christian. But what did you think the strongest points were in your presentation and the greatest weaknesses in Dr. Ehrman's case?
I don't know about the greatest weaknesses in his case. I'd have to think about that. Because he all he's doing is pretty much a negative argument against, right? He doesn't have
Yeah.
his own argument for the authorship. I mean, he does, and it's like seriously ad hoc without a scrap of direct evidence for it. But he didn't give that during the debate. So,
Mm.
um, so I would say the strongest evidence we have for the traditional authorship of the Gospels is the fact that it's pretty unanimous in the early church who wrote them. In that debate, I cited 6 sources just from the second century alone who talk about the authorship of the Gospels or something very closely related to it. And they're unanimous. So even when you go into centuries after that, there's only one account, and that's from the fourth century that mentions the Allegoi, who earlier had said that Cerinthus, the Gnostic, who was Gnostic, wrote the Gospel of John. But other than that lone claim, it's unanimous that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote it. So, and this comes fairly early, and it's from various geographical regions. So you've got Judea, you've got Gaul, you have Rome, you have Egypt, Judea, you've got all these different places, regions, which means it spread fairly quickly who these authors were. And it's unanimous, like I said. So if these things are just legends develop, you might have someone in Egypt who's making up and inventing a name on the Gospels that's different than someone in Rome who makes up a name, But it's
Yeah.
always Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John from diverse, separate regions and 6 sources within the first century. So I think that's pretty strong. And then you've got, as I pointed out, you have the internal evidence, which it just needs to be consistent. In ancient biographies, it was standard for them to be anonymous. And I mean, we have about 90 biographies of people, and these biographies were composed within about 150 years on each side of Jesus. And all of them except one, all but one, are anonymous in the same sense the Gospels are. You say, well, Mike, maybe you're just cherry picking here. You've done this 150 years on each side. What if you were to expand that? Well, you don't have much before that in terms of biographies, but afterward, the very next one would be the life of Elias in the Historia Augusta, written at the end of the 4th century. And that is considered to be unreliable by classicists. So, no, that doesn't help at all. If anything, it strengthens my case even more. So it was typical for things to be, for biographies to be anonymous. So for internal evidence, we're just looking for something that is consistent with the traditional authorship, the external claims. And we have that for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So I think that's pretty good evidence. And as I said at the end of that debate, I apply the parity principle. I prepared for this debate for 4 months. And I'll be honest with you, I wasn't sure I was going to come out on Matthew and John with this. And I wasn't going to force myself to come to Matthew and John because I like being honest with it and calling things as I see them. So if it's, I was particularly concerned about Matthew. And in fact, I didn't even think I was going to come out saying that Matthew wrote Matthew, but I did. And what brought me to that in the end was not only the external evidence and the internal evidence, but something I call the parity principle. And the parity principle ensures fairness by comparing similar cases in a similar manner. It's like what, as I pointed out to Bart in the debate, he said, look, the first person to explicitly come out in a crystal clear manner, talk about the Gospels being written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is Irenaeus. And he's doing that about 100 years later. Not quite, but almost 100 years, a century after the Gospels were written. And I pointed out how, well, that's mistaken because, when it comes to Mark, Mark, Papias, who's writing in the early 2nd century, is explicit that Mark wrote what he remembered Peter saying. So other than that, though, he'd be correct with Matthew, Luke, and John in terms of explicitly attributing them to Matthew, Luke, and John. So, but if a century is too long, then what do you do with Tacitus? Let's be fair here and apply the parity principle. Tacitus, the first person to talk about, attribute Tacitus as the author of the Annals of Rome, is Jerome, writing about 300 years later. The first person to attribute the war with Catiline and the war with Jugurtha to Sallust, one of the greatest Roman historians, is Quintilian, writing about 135 years later. The first account to specifically tribute Plutarch's lives to Plutarch is the Lamprias Catalog, writing more than 200, at least 200 years after Plutarch wrote. And is falsely attributed to Plutarch's son. So do you reject the traditional authorship of Plutarch's lives, of Tacitus's Annals of Rome, of Sallust's 2 wars, Suetonius's Lives of the 12 Divine Caesars, which I think the first person to mention that is someone writing a couple hundred years later. I think it's Tertullian, writing about 200 years later. So what do you do with that? If you're going to reject the Gospels of that, then you're going to have to downgrade your confidence that Plutarch, Suetonius, Sallust, all those guys, Tacitus wrote those things, but those things are unquestioned. They're not even questioned by classicists. So I think that New Testament scholars are just being far too skeptical, their burden of proof is far too high. If we look at how history is done outside of the New Testament, they're not as critical. The burden of proof is not nearly as high as what you have for the New Testament literature.
Those are some very good points, and I appreciate bringing those up. Now, you're a well-known as an advocate of the minimal facts approach to the resurrection of Christ. Can you summarize what that, I'll just throw this in too. William Lane Craig is a very good debater. I mean, obviously, I'm a Christian, I'm biased.
He's the best.
I think he typically crushes his opponents, like just the smithereens. But anyway, what is the history of the what is the minimal facts approach to the resurrection?
Well, this is something that was started by Gary Habermas back in the 70s in his doctoral dissertation at Michigan State University. So what he did was, and it has morphed over time. It's like there's minimal facts 1.0 in that dissertation. And it was like, look, let's take, here are 12 facts that are granted by the majority of scholars pertaining to, related to Jesus's resurrection. So even skeptical scholars who reject the resurrection, they still, for the most part, the majority of them accept these 12 facts. So that was like minimal facts 1.0. Minimal facts 2.0 later, he developed a few years later, and he said, look, in fact, you could choose just maybe 4 out of these 12. Choose any 4 you want. And we can build a very good case for the resurrection just based on those 4 facts. So we can certainly build a strong case for the resurrection based on 12 facts, minimal facts. Then minimal facts 2, we don't even need all 12. You just choose any 4 you want, and we can build a good case. It's like what Rush Limbaugh used to say, right? Half his brain tied behind his back just to make things fair. And then minimal facts 3.0 is kind of what he uses now, I think. And it's like, all right, we're going to, I think he uses 6 facts now in his magnum opus, which is like, there's going to be 4 volumes. The 4th volume is coming out this spring. Volume 3 came out last spring. And I think that kind of presented minimal facts 3.0. And it's like, well, here are 6 facts that are granted. These particular 6 facts are granted by the vast majority of critical scholars. And vast majority, I think he goes with like 85% or higher, something like that. So these 6 facts, I can build a really strong case for the resurrection based on these 6 facts. So what's nice about that is it's like, okay, well, you're not going to say, well, those scholars are all Christian scholars. Well, that's certainly not the case. You have even non-Christian scholars, the vast majority of them, in the relevant fields that are granting these as facts. So that's kind of the minimal facts case.
Okay, all right. Thanks for sharing that. What would you view, like if you get a book like 5 Views on Apologetics, they have classical apologetics, evidentialism, cumulative case, presuppositionalism, reformed epistemology. Where would you view the minimal facts approach in those sorts of methodologies, and what would you view as the strengths of that approach as contrasted with some other views of how to defend the Christian faith?
Is historical apologetics one of the 5?
Well, in that book, I mean, they're just picking 5 views. They had classical apologetics, evidentialism, cumulative case, presuppositionalism, and reformed epistemology.
Evidential would be where the minimum facts is. And that's where I am. I don't have problems with the others. I kind of consider them like the love languages, right? So you read that book by Gary Chapman, The 5 Love Languages. Some things appeal, some people feel loved one way, like, what are they? You have words of affirmation, physical affection, gift giving, quality time, and acts of service. Now, some are going to be like words of affirmation. That's what they want to hear. That's how they feel loved. They want to hear from the other person, hey, I love you. This is why I love you. They want to hear words of praise and affirmation. That's how they feel loved. Another one, it's like, well, they'll like that, but the way they feel loved, let's say a woman goes out to the mall for something, she comes back and she sees that her husband has vacuumed the entire house, has put some of the laundry in, the dishwasher's running, and he's got dinner in the oven. That acts of service, now she really feels loved by that more than if he says good words, of affirmation. Some, it's like sex or even just hugs or holding hands. I feel loved by you showing it to me in some kind of a physical, affectionate manner. So someone who's like physical affectionate, that's how they experience love. Maybe they don't really feel loved, even if the person is complimenting them a lot. You got to love that person according to that love language. Well, I kind of see truth languages in that kind of sense. And for me, a kind of presuppositional apologetics would not have done a thing for me. It wouldn't have done a thing. Classical apologetics is kind of neat insofar as, it provides a really good, strong, cumulative case. But for me, when I was doubting my faith, my final semester in grad school in the fall of 1985, I went to Gary Habermas's office. I've never met him at that point. My roommate suggested I go see him. And when I did, it's like, well, I didn't want to sit there in his office for 3 hours or 4 hours or whatever, where he starts off, evidence for God's existence and, building all the way up, and giving me a cumulative case. Look, I just needed some stuff for reaffirmation at that point. And the minimal facts was like really good in that way. Another thing is, I understand that, one of the things that I've caused me to doubt over time is I look and I say, people who are a lot smarter than me, whose IQ is off the charts, they would disagree with me. They disagree with one another. How can I even know? Then we get to kind of epistemology, right? But how can I even know what is true? Can I even really know truth here? And how can I know whether I know what is true is true? So that kind of caused me some doubts. What the minimal facts approach kind of does is like, look, there's a lot of things, and some things are grounded in better evidence than others. So the evidence that Jesus died for crucifixion is better attested than that he was born of a virgin. Doesn't mean I shouldn't believe he was born of a virgin. It just means there's a whole lot more evidence for his death by crucifixion than there is that he was born of a virgin. So, and people, will dispute various things about, well, are the Gospels historically reliable? And what do you do with this? And what about the genocide in the Old Testament and genre and all that kind of stuff? And it's like, you know what? The minimal facts approach, even if I couldn't come to solid answers on some of these other questions, the minimal facts approach gives me some solid ground to walk on. Because it's like, okay, well, this is supported by data that's so strong that even skeptical scholars are compelled to grant them as facts. And if I can build a strong case for the resurrection on those things, I think I'm on pretty good ground. So I think there's a number of reasons why the minimal facts approach really appeals to me over some of these others. But that's me. Someone else may not find it as, maybe they want a cumulative approach, or maybe a presuppositionalist approach is the thing that really speaks to them. None of them would have really helped my dad. He didn't doubt at all. He didn't understand, could not comprehend at all. He was a strong Calvinist, could not comprehend at all why I experienced doubts at times. So it's like no apologetic methodology, except maybe the Reformed one, would be something he could even relate to. So like I said, like there's different love languages, there's different truth languages.
Interesting comparison. Now, you published in 2010, I believe, a very large book called The Resurrection of Jesus, a New Historiographical Approach. I read it cover to cover. It took me a while, all the footnotes as well. Thought there were many good points in there. Um, this may be a challenge because it's quite massive, but can you summarize the content of that book? Maybe give us a bit of the backstory. And since it's been a while since you published it, is there anything else you would want to change to it or add to it were you to revise it?
So the backstory to that is Gary Habermas and I were finishing up writing our book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, which came out in 2004, but it had to be done by 2003, right? So as we're getting toward the end of that, and I knew Gary had been doing so much study on the resurrection his whole life, I said, and he had compiled this bibliography. I don't remember, it was 2,200 or 2,400 academic sources on the resurrection since 1975. I think that's now about 5,000 or 5,500 he's up to. But it was like 2,200, 2,400 at the time. And I said, you know, you're so familiar with the academic literature, but you have all these scholars, they're looking at the same data and they arrive at different conclusions. How is that? And who are these scholars? And he said, well, of course, most of them, almost all of them are New Testament scholars. And you have a few philosophers in there and maybe a couple of general historians. And I thought to myself, well, how much training do these New Testament scholars have in historical inquiry? In my doctoral research, I looked at all the Ivy League schools in their undergrad, grad, and doctoral programs for their philosophy departments and religion departments. And I found that you combine all the Ivy League schools, undergrad, grad, doctoral programs in those departments, and all the courses that were taught on historical methodology. And there was only one. It was a
Oh,
doctoral
wow.
seminar at Princeton. That
Hmm.
was it. And yet you'll have a lot of students come out of there claiming to be historians of Jesus, and they haven't had the first course on historical methodology or how to do history or what it is that historians are actually doing. So they're parroting one another. They're just like, they don't know what they're doing, a lot of them. And so I thought, well, how would a professional historian, how would a general historian who has been trained in these things, how would they approach it? So I thought, well, that's what I want to do my doctoral research on. And so I did. Took me 5.5 years of working on this thing. It ended up being like 3 to 4 times longer than the average doctoral dissertation. But I really focused on matters pertaining to the philosophy of history, historical method, and then using those things step by step. So in the book, it's like I see myself as a guide as I take readers through my museum and I guide them. Okay, what is history? What is it that historians are actually doing? What methods do they use to arrive at their conclusions about the past? And what do those conclusions actually mean? And then so you go through things such as the postmodern challenge too. And what do postmodern historians say? And what
Depends.
are some
Up to you or up to me. It's all very subjective, right?
Yeah. So how do we address some of those things? And
Yeah.
where are the majority of historians like that? So then and then what about when a miracle story is in view? Does that change how we approach it as historians? There's a whole debate over this. Some general historians and philosophers of history will say historians aren't even in a position where they can investigate a miracle claim, and they give several reasons why. Well, then I investigate those. Well, how legitimate are those reasons? And what can historians actually do that? And then I look at and I say, well, okay, the first thing you do then, if you're going to investigate the past, is you look for your best sources. What are your best sources? If you're going to look at did Caesar cross the Rubicon, what are you going to look at? Who are your best sources? Why are they your best sources? And so we do that with matters pertaining to the fate of Jesus and say, okay, we're looking through these best sources. we're mining through them. What can we learn with a great deal of confidence? And then we come up with these facts, which are very much like the minimal facts. And I came up with three. And then let's apply historical method then. We will formulate a number of hypotheses. Let's look at the six major ones offered by scholars today, and then let's subject them to the historical method that I cover in chapter 1 and see which one comes out on top. So that's in essence the book and how it works. What would I change today? I think I was too reserved about what I thought about the Gospels, because at that point I hadn't really done much research on the historical reliability of the Gospels. I've done quite a bit more research since, so I might touch on it more, but I might not, because that's one of those things that is discussed more among scholars today and debated. And if I'm doing something closer to historical bedrock or minimal facts, the Gospels are going to come in, but not as robustly as maybe I would use them otherwise. So I don't know. If I were to do it again today, I'd probably say more about the Gospels than I did. But at that point, I knew that there wasn't widespread agreement on how reliable they are. And so it's like with the empty tomb. I talked about some evidence for the empty tomb, but I said ultimately, this isn't one of our historical bedrock here. And because I was requiring 90% or better acceptance of it. So I left that out. I left out the appearance to James, because even though that's 90%, at least it was at the time, not enough scholars. There's only, I think I counted 29 scholars who commented on the appearance to James. Did he convert as a result of that? Was he a Christian at the time? What actually happened here? Not many people, there was only like 29 scholars. And even though about 90% of them, it's like only 3 out of the 29 thought that James was a believer prior to Jesus' death. I just didn't think 29 scholars was a robust enough number to count. I wanted something closer to 100. If I'm going to say this is what the majority of scholars are believing. So I was trying to be as careful as possible. So anyway, it's a long answer to a short question. Sorry about that.
It was a long book too, so it was shorter than reading it and writing it. That reading it's shorter than writing it. So I would say that a typical man on the street skeptic type person might say the disciples stole the body of Christ, maybe during the time before Pilate approved the chief priest for tomb guards. And then the records of the appearances are just hallucinations or embellishments. What would be your response to that sort of kind of pretty common view that is taken out there?
First, I don't know of any scholars today, no matter how skeptical, who would say the disciples stole the body. And the reason being is because it is well evidenced, very strongly evidenced, that the disciples not only proclaimed Jesus rose and appeared to them, the evidence strongly suggests they truly believed it. And the reason being is because we have all sorts of reports from the first century, 5 from the first century alone, that talk about how these disciples were willing to suffer persecution continuously for their gospel proclamation, and that some, at least Paul and Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, at least those 3 died as martyrs for their faith, and which shows that they sincerely believed what they were proclaiming is true. And when you continue to proclaim the same message when your colleagues had just been martyred for doing the same, it shows that you have the same conviction. It's kind of like years ago, you remember those 21 Coptic Christians who were in orange jumpsuits, were paraded on a beach and beheaded.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, they died for what they believed is true, and because they were giving the chance to go free if they would deny Christ and convert to Islam, and they said no, we believe Jesus is Lord. And all 21 were decapitated. Well, if you had some other Coptic Christians who were out proclaiming the same message publicly, you know, and putting their lives in danger for doing the same message as their colleagues did, they show that they're just as willing to die for their beliefs, whether or not they actually end up martyred. So it seems like, at least in my research, virtually all scholars, you'd be hard pressed to find a scholar who would say the disciples did not think that Jesus rose and had appeared to them. So the theft, that they stole the body, I don't know of anyone who takes that. Maybe, like you said, people on the street, but I don't know of
Yeah.
any scholars. The hallucination one, now that is still fairly popular. If they're Gary Habermas has pointed out, and I think he's right. I don't keep up with this anymore like he does. But he said, and my impression is the same, but he said that in the literature, academic literature, scholars more recently are not tending to posit a naturalistic explanation. Instead, they're just trying to say, well, historians can't investigate miracle claims, which, for one, that does tell you about the state of naturalistic alternatives. They're not
It
doing
does.
too well,
Hmm.
right? But when an alternative naturalistic hypothesis is adopted by a skeptical scholar, more times than not, it is the hallucination hypothesis. You can understand why, disciples are grief stricken. They had loved Jesus, had traveled with him for 1.5 to 3 years. Then all of a sudden, Jesus is arrested. He's brutally tortured and cruelly crucified, the most painful death in antiquity. And so now it's like, well, we thought we were going to rule with him. He told us we were going to rule with him. What's And just like most messianic movements, when their Messiah was killed by the Romans, they just went back to life before their leader, or they tried to find someone else. But these guys, they're disoriented, they're grief stricken. What's going on here? So you could expect that at least some of them would hallucinate. My mom died in 2013. A few months later, my dad experienced what I would consider a grief hallucination. He woke up in the middle of the night. He said he saw her sitting in a chair there, looking at him. She was beautiful. She was luminescent. So there was an apparition. Now, whether that was an objective apparition, I think objective apparitions occur, or whether it was a subjective one, a hallucination, I don't know. But if it was a hallucination, I mean, you can understand he was grief stricken. When my mom died, he wanted to die. He didn't want to live anymore without her.
Mm.
He was lonely. So you can understand why the disciples would some of them would at least hallucinate. Problems with that? One, if you grant the empty tomb, I think the tomb was empty. Most scholars do, but it doesn't come close to that vast majority of a heterogeneous vast majority of scholars. So I didn't include it. But if the tomb was empty, well, wasn't a hallucination, or maybe it was, but then you got to put together a combination hypothesis. But it wouldn't, like what they understand about hallucinations is that the group most likely to experience a hallucination are people grieving the loss of a loved one. So the disciples would qualify here, but only 14% of that. I had been saying 7%, but I've been shown wrong on that recently. It's 14%. 14% of those grieving the loss of a loved one experience a visual hallucination. Only 14%. So that being the case, 100% of the disciples claimed to experience, they would have had to experience a visual hallucination of Jesus. So that's one problem. Second is that hallucinations are private occurrences in the mind of an individual. They have no external reality. So I like to say they're like dreams, right? So I couldn't get a group together of, say, 100 people and say, all right, we're all going to take a sleeping pill. And I want us all to dream that we're in Hawaii. And then we'll get up in the morning and we will talk about our dream. Now, of that 100, I don't know what percentage. Might be different for every test, but certainly nothing close to 100% is going to dream they're in Hawaii. They might even go to sleep thinking about Hawaii, but not even close to 100% are going to actually dream they're in Hawaii. And then of the whatever group it was that dreamt they're in Hawaii, what percentage of those do you think would have had the content of their dreams would have been so similar that when they discussed it among one another, they thought that they were all in the same dream? It's not going to happen. So, why? Because dreams are private occurrences in the mind of an individual. They have no external reality. Same thing of hallucinations. So, what it would require is that 100% of these disciples, which only 14% of them, maybe two of them at most, would have had a visual hallucination. 100% of them would have had to hallucinate simultaneously, and the content of those hallucinations would have been so similar that they all thought they saw the same thing, and that these happened not once, twice, but at least three times. That just seems very unlikely. And then third, what about Paul? Paul wasn't grieving Jesus' death. He believed Jesus was a failed prophet, a false Messiah. So Jesus would have been the last person in the world that Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see. So the hallucination hypothesis suffers from a great deal of problems.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of good points there. Um, so I thought that was interesting that today so many skeptical people not take a specific hypothesis. So how would you answer the skeptic who said, we don't know what happened to the body of Jesus, but we know that dead men don't rise, so Jesus Christ did not rise from the dead?
Um, well, I guess I'd answer that by saying, well, how do we know that the dead don't rise? You're going to have to unpack that.
Sure. Well, because naturalism is true. I mean, it's what Hume said. We all know that those types of things just don't happen.
Right, because Hume says the uniformity of testimony is that, when a person dies, they stay dead. And it's only the ignorant who are saying otherwise. The problem is that is not the uniform testimony of people. There have been plenty who have talked about miracles occurring. Craig Keener, in his two volumes, documents many miracles reported from antiquity all the way up to the present time. Some of them are quite well evidenced. Some of them are evidenced by people like physicians who have MDs. You've got like Dale Allison and others. Dale Allison teaches at Princeton, got a PhD, one of the top New Testament scholars in the world. He talks about apparitions and other kind of paranormal phenomena that do not fit within naturalism. So it's not just the naive and the uneducated. Even very educated people can believe in miracles and the supernatural. So these critiques by Hume are just simply wrong. They're just wrongly stated. So I would say the naturalism. What evidence do you have for naturalism? You want positive evidence for the resurrection of Jesus? Well, you're taking this other worldview, naturalism. Give me some evidence for it. There isn't any evidence for naturalism.
Okay, yeah. All right, well, thank you for sharing that. I'm going to put up a slide here just so that people can see this quote. This gentleman here was, I'm probably very familiar with him, but
Yeah,
so
Pincus Lapide wrote
Orthodox
a short
Jew.
book on the resurrection.
Yeah, so the resurrection of Jesus, a Jewish perspective. I hope I pronounce his name right. Pincus Lapidie. I don't know.
I
I
pronounce
guess
it Lapide,
Lapide.
but maybe
Okay,
I'm
okay.
wrong.
So the picture he's happy. So I guess he didn't get offended. But he said, "I accept the resurrection of Jesus not as an invention of the community of disciples, but as a historical event." But he remained an Orthodox Jew, saying Jesus may have risen based on an irreducible core of minimal facts, but that does not mean he was the Messiah. And I think he said that Maimonides took the same thing. So he said, even if we would grant the resurrection, which he didn't think was the case, for the sake of argument, we should not be convinced that Jesus is the Messiah. So the question here would be, is the bare fact of resurrection sufficient to establish Christianity?
Well, I think here we got to look at probabilities, right? What seems most plausible. So the way I view this, Thomas, is Jesus did claim to be Messiah. Um, this is abundantly attested in throughout the Gospels, and so we have multiple attestation in terms of the motif where he's Messiah, he's claiming to be Messiah, he's doing the things that are Messiah. It's kind of like when John the Baptist is in prison and he sends two of his disciples to Jesus and they ask, "Are you the one or are we to expect someone else?" And Jesus had done some miracles in their midst and he says, "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The deaf hear, the blind see, the lame are walking, the dead are raised, and the gospel is preached to the poor." Well, when you go to Isaiah, you find that those are the things, the very things that Isaiah says the Messiah will do. When you go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, I believe it's scroll 4, scroll 4, uh, what is it, 4Q 521, something like that, gives the same thing. So even Qumran, they had the same messianic expectations. And Jesus, here, he's saying, "You want to know if I'm the one? Look, I have done. You've seen with your eyes and heard with your ears the very things that are anticipated of the Messiah doing. I've done it. You've seen it. You've been eyewitness to this. So, yes." So, when you see, um, like in John, the Jewish leaders say, "Why to keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly." And Jesus says, "I have told you, the works that I do, these testify of who I am." So you've got all these different, this motif of Jesus claiming to be the Messiah that's spread throughout all the Gospels. Now, if a guy predicts his resurrection and then accomplishes it, and he claimed to be the Messiah, I think we should believe him.
Sure, sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's I think there are some reasons why not too many people followed that gentleman in his position on that. I did read your as well your interesting book, Paul Meets Muhammad, a Christian Muslim debate on the resurrection. And I thought you made many points there that seriously problematized Muslim claims. And some of them, you mentioned you debated Shabir. I got to debate Shabir in Wisconsin too. It was pretty fun on the topic, the New Testament picture of Jesus, is it
Hmm.
accurate? And that was a blessing.
Was that last year?
No, that was a few years ago. We're in
Okay.
California now, but it was fun. It was a blessing. So he's a nice guy.
Oh,
I
yeah.
thought it was quite interesting actually. The person who took him back to the airport said, now this is just one person's testimony, but that the person who took him back to the airport said that Shabir told him that he had not read the Bible through cover to cover, which was quite an interesting thing for that, assuming that that was an accurate testimony. But then again, when I looking at the Quran, where it's not the sort of same unified thing, but it's just longest surah to shortest surah. I even have a study Quran. In the front of the study Quran, it says you don't have to read the whole Quran, just read the parts that speak to you. So I can kind of understand him treating the Bible more like that, where you just read certain parts. But I would not want to debate a Muslim if I hadn't read the Quran. But anyway, most Muslims say that Christ did not die by crucifixion, but Allah made it seem like that is what happened, which kind of makes Allah the author of Christianity, which would be kind of an interesting thing to do, but that
Yeah.
wouldn't be what Muslims would want to conclude. But I'm wondering if you could respond to the standard Muslim claim that Christ did not die by crucifixion, but was raised by Allah without dying.
Okay. So first, I'd say that the Muslim position goes against all of the evidence we have that Jesus did die by crucifixion. So you have the early testimony of Paul and the oral tradition embedded in his letters. You have the four Gospels. You have people like Clement of Rome and Polycarp and Ignatius, some of the early church fathers, who talk about the death of Jesus, who knew the apostles. You have non-Christian sources like Tacitus, Josephus, Lucian, Bar Serapion. So unsympathetic sources there. So you have early sources, multiple independent sources, unsympathetic sources. I think, I would argue you probably got some eyewitness sources in there. If so, you have the majority of Johannine scholars who speak to the issue, which is not all of them. A majority of Johannine specialists do give firm opinions, but some don't, but the majority do. And of those, a large majority of them think, I think it's like 70 some percent, think that there is eyewitness testimony behind John's gospel. Oh, they may not think it was John, the son of Zebedee. A lot of them think it was a minor disciple, but they still think that there's eyewitness testimony behind it. You got Peter, who's probably the eyewitness behind Mark's gospel. And the majority of scholars who do comment on it do think that the traditional authorship of Mark is correct. So I think you probably got some eyewitness testimony. Again, you got early testimony, multiple independent sources, embarrassing sources, unsympathetic sources. When I say embarrassing sources, it's like you look at the Jewish martyrdom literature and the Jews who go to martyrdom, like you find in 2 Maccabees chapter 7, with the 7 brothers who were tortured and brutally executed. Or some others like Rabbi Akiba and so forth, who have their flesh combed and they die. Even some of the Christian martyrdom literature, like the martyrdom of Polycarp, or even the martyrdom of Stephen in the book of Acts, you have them who are very, very bold, courageous, unflinching, going to their death. I will jokingly say, based on, I rephrase a lot of what they said and put it together and say, right before they die, they tell the person torturing them, saying, rocks and stones may break my bones, but resurrection awaits me. And that's kind of what they were saying. You can destroy this body, but I'm getting it back in the resurrection. At the end, just before they die, they usually say something like, God, I have not forsaken your law. Well, what do we have in the Gospels? You have Jesus in Gethsemane, and he's saying, Father, if it's your will, let this cup pass from me. It's like, well, how inspiring is that to his disciples, to whom he said, if you want to be my disciple, you have to take up your cross and follow me. They knew what it was like to be scourged and tortured horribly, and then marched publicly and naked through the main street, and then impaled to a cross. They wanted to avoid it. And yet Jesus, when it comes time for him, he's saying, Father, if it's your will, let this cup pass from me. And then on the cross, he doesn't say, God, I have not forsaken your law. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, so when you look at the Gospels and how they report Jesus' death compared to how we see Jewish and Christian martyrs, it's kind of embarrassing. And it's like, but it's more realistic. It's more realistic. And so it's like the Gospel authors are trying to be truthful in reporting how it actually occurred. And so that gives us reason to believe Jesus died by crucifixion. So, number one, all the evidence we have, and it's very, very strong evidence that Jesus died by crucifixion. Another thing I would point out is something that you kind of alluded to there, Thomas. Why would God, why would Allah allow the Christians to go on, the disciples to go on believing that Jesus died and rose from the dead, when he could have easily corrected them by having Jesus or an angel tell them what actually happened? Instead, he allowed them to be deceived. And I mean, we can understand why God would allow the Romans and the Jewish leaders who had Jesus crucified, why he would deceive them. But why would he allow the disciples of Jesus to be deceived? Disciples whom the Qur'an on 2 occasions referred to as Muslims. Why does he allow them to be deceived and now then to spread the word without correction and allow Christianity to become the #1 challenge ever to Islam. That doesn't seem to be very smart of the all-wise God, right? And then you got to say, look, if he's willing to deceive Jesus' disciples who are Muslims, how do you know he hasn't deceived you? He's willing to deceive the disciples of Prophet Jesus. How much more would he be willing to deceive you, Mr. or Miss Muslim? And then finally, I throw in what's called the Islamic catch-22 argument. I think I can give several arguments, historical arguments, that Jesus actually predicted his death and resurrection. So let's just talk about that. Jesus predicts his death, all right? His imminent death, meaning, right there in the first century. If Jesus did not die, then that means he was a false prophet. But the Quran says he was a great prophet. So the Quran would be wrong on that matter, wouldn't it? Let's say that Jesus did die as he predicted. Well, Surah 4, verses 157, 158 says that he didn't. So in that case, the Quran would be wrong as well. So whether Jesus died or did not die, the Quran is wrong. So there's numerous reasons for rejecting what the Quran is saying.
Yeah, I think that those are definitely very strong arguments. It's something you just brought up. I think this is not how most Muslims argue it, but I think this would actually be a more sophisticated way of doing it. So I'm going to make a Muslim argument here, maybe a more sophisticated Muslim response to a minimal facts apologetic. Something like this. So we have texts, Quranic texts that say things like, surely I'm going to take you in death and raise you to myself. Peace the day I die and the day I am raised up alive. When you took me in death, you became the watcher over them. And so we've got stuff like that where it does look like the Quran is saying that Jesus dies and then is raised. And so then the later argument from Surah 5, 117 appears to be later than the 4, 157, 158, where that seems to deny the resurrection. So maybe we need to reinterpret 4, 157, 158. Maybe it's abrogated, something like that, by 5, 1, 117. So the pro-resurrection surah are later, at least one of them is later. And so therefore, Christ did die and did rise, and we're going to reinterpret 4, 157, 158. But the Muslim apologists could say that the mere fact of the resurrection doesn't establish Christianity. And a Muslim could similarly say he could grant all of the above for the sake of argument rather than explicitly affirming it. He could say, look, Allah raised the man from the dead after 100 years. He raised the man to identify as murderer. So resurrection doesn't uniquely I validate Jesus. And furthermore, maybe he read your book and he says, look, Dr. Licona, historians may conclude that a particular event occurred while leaving a question mark pertaining to its cause. So therefore, the mere fact of the resurrection, he could say, doesn't get you to the truth of Christianity. And he would say, well, Islam is saying this would happen. And besides, you say that the Gospels can put words in the mouth of Jesus and others, transplant historical events, embellish. So therefore, the Islamic Jesus was the original Jesus, and Allah raised him from the dead as a prophet. I think that actually a better argument than the more common Muslim argument. But how would you respond to that argument?
I agree with you. I think that would be a better argument. My understanding is that those texts in the Quran where it talks about Jesus dying and being raised is referring to, and I'm not a scholar of Islam, of course. You probably know more about it than I do. But I understand that is supposed to occur when Jesus returns. He returns and then he's killed and then God raises him. But
yeah, I think that's what they commonly say. But though I think it's interesting if you pay attention to the surah, it looks like when he says, peace the day I die and the day, it looks like the order is die and raised up alive. So I think that you have to find a way to justify it by saying, well, he's going to die in the future. But I don't think that'd be the natural understanding of the texts. Though if you're going to be killed for denying it, maybe all of a sudden what becomes less natural becomes more natural, so you don't get killed. I don't know. But anyway, go ahead.
So I guess I would say, talk about the abrogation first and say, well, if the Quran is eternal, why would something have to be abrogated? I mean, you would think that it would be if God's changing his mind over time, but this is supposed to be eternal in the heavens, and if the Quran existed before God even created the earth, why would you have to abrogate something? And if you did, like, why wouldn't you just have like a second edition rather than having the first and the corrected in there together? Either you said that the Jews didn't kill him, God only made it appear that they did, and he took him up. Well, if you're abrogating that, does that mean that that first one is wrong? Did it mean that you really didn't rescue him? That they really did kill him, as they said? So it's different than an abrogation. All right, this is my law now. Well, I'm going to change it and relate to you a little bit different later on. The Quran is saying he did something. He did, past tense, here in Surah 4. And then in Surah 5, it's like, oh, no, I'm abrogating that. Okay, well, were you wrong then? So that would be one problem I'd see. Another thing I'd say is, yeah, even though I do think that Jesus' words in the Gospels, for the most part, are not word for word with what Jesus said. I mean, Jesus spoke mainly in Aramaic, and the Gospels are in Greek, so they're already a translation. And then when you compare what he says in parallel text, they're often a little bit different. So it shows that there is some sort of paraphrasing involved. John, I think, will reword Jesus. I would put it in a sense like, instead of reading the New American Standard Bible, which is the most literal English translation, in my opinion, you're reading more of like the Living Bible, or the message, where things are reworded as a paraphrase. I think that's kind of like what John is doing a lot of. I think he's communicating the same message, however, and they would have been allowed to do something like that. We still have Jesus predicting his death and resurrection in there. That's very clear by multiple independent sources, some of which are going to be grounded in eyewitness testimony. So even if you've got some editing that's going on behalf of some of the gospel authors, or even all of them, you still have this motif of Jesus predicting his imminent death and resurrection that's crystal clear, that permeates all four gospels. So you don't get out of this easily by just saying, well, they were willing to change the words a little and edit Jesus in that sense. You still have Jesus predicting it and saying the scriptures teach that the Son of Man has to die and rise from the dead. So again, if it didn't happen, it makes him a false prophet, and the Quran would be wrong.
Well, I think that the argument, and again, I'm not convinced this is a valid argument. I'm not planning to convert to Islam anytime soon. But
oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it is saying he died and rose. So
yeah, they say he did die and rise.
Yeah, you're right.
But
So I'd have to
therefore,
get rid of the 22.
it's just the Islam. This validates that he's a prophet of Allah versus so. I think in the West, typically in a secular Western society, the big thing is, oh, he didn't actually rise. But we've got 1 billion Muslims who believe the Quran, and so let's say some big shot Muslim like Shabir. I think Shabir actually doesn't want to deny that Jesus would died by crucifixion, because he knows how problematic it is to.
I thought, at least when I debated him years ago, I thought that Shabir thought that Jesus was crucified, but God rescued him from death.
But he's willing to fudge things a little bit to make it so it's not as historically implausible. So let's say we find a way to get out of that, but he did actually rise, but it was just Allah raising him, validating he was a prophet of Islam.
Yeah. Yeah, then I couldn't use the, you're correct in pointing that out. I couldn't use the Islamic catch-22. So I guess at that point, I would go with, so was God wrong in Surah 4? That would be one. And I guess I could still appeal to, well, let's see, I couldn't appeal to God deceiving the disciples because he actually did die and rise from the dead. So I would go with, well, I guess it's more than an abrogation. Then you're saying God was wrong when he composed Surah 4. I would have to say that. But then you'd have to say Jesus was wrong in his teachings, that he was the Son of God, the uniquely divine Son of God, because I think we've got good evidence that he did that as well. And that would conflict with the Qur'an, right? So I think there's a couple answers we come up with that. Now, does it prove Christianity's true? I know Dale Allison doesn't think that he believes Jesus rose, but he doesn't think it proves Christianity's true because he thinks that Buddhists and Hindus have their own interpretation of what happened to him, why Jesus came back from death, reincarnation or rainbow bodies. But as I point out with him, the you know, we're not looking. What we are looking at with the disciples saying that Jesus rose and therefore Christianity is true. Jesus, when he's claiming to be the Son of God, he's claiming to be Messiah, he's claiming to be the only way to God. He's making these kinds of claims. And of course, the Jewish critics are saying, well, yeah, all right, buddy, well, give us some sign that the stuff that you are who you're claiming to be. And he says, oh, my main sign for that's going to be my death and resurrection. So we should believe him on those things. And Jesus is teaching a lot of things that is very much in conflict with Islamic teachings, mainly that he's claiming to be God's son, right? Uniquely divine son. So if that is shirk to say something like that, that Jesus is God's uniquely divine son, well, Jesus himself is the one saying it, and he's going to confirm it by rising from the dead. Again, I think that creates a big problem for those who are going to say, well, it doesn't prove that Christianity is true. And as for Allison's thing, you know, the disciples are the ones who heard Jesus told them these things about the importance of his resurrection. They are in a really good situation to know what he meant by them. And so with Jesus rising from the dead, this isn't like a Hindu or Buddhist interpretation that retrofits their own worldview on what happens with Jesus. No, the disciples are relating this according to Jesus's own interpretation of what happens. So you got to either say Jesus is wrong on this, which I guess a Muslim could. After all, if they're saying that Surah 5 abrogates Surah 4, then Allah was wrong in Surah 4, so I guess Jesus could be wrong in claiming to be God's son.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're going to end up conceding a lot. It's going to be hard to be consistent with the Quran being the word of God if you start conceding too much like that. But I think it might be a better argument than the one that he didn't actually get crucified, but you just have some serious problems with the Quranic argument here, period. So
I'm
yeah,
curious,
thank you for
Thomas,
that.
how did your debate with Shabir go?
I thought it went well. I thought it went well. So I'm thankful for actually I and maybe I don't know if we have time to get into this now. I actually was not as much I would be more, how would you put this? Um Less willing to do the paraphrase stuff, living Bible stuff, what Christ said. So, but I think he was actually, I'd be more arguing the way that maybe, um, the book The Jesus Crisis. I thought I was be more like that by Farnell and Thomas.
Oh, no, I don't know that one.
You know that book? Okay. Well, anyway, more. I don't think that we actually have like Q, Mark, and priority. More like ancient church view, Matthew and priority, and some other stuff like that. But I thought the debate went well, and I'm thankful for the opportunity that I had with him. And he was definitely a nice guy, but sort of the traditional theological liberal arguments that he makes, which are often better than Muslim arguments.
Yeah,
But
I agree with you.
so with minimal facts. Apologetics, um, David Hackett Fisher, who wrote the book Historians' Fallacies. So he talks about the fallacy of the prevalent proof.
That's a great book.
Yeah, yeah, it's very helpful. I think it is a very good book. So he says making mass opinion a method of verification. That's the fallacy. Many scholars have attempted to establish a doubtful question by a phrase such as most historians agree, or it is the consensus of scholarly opinion that, without providing empirical evidence, the fallacy of the prevalent proof commonly takes this form: deference to the historiographical majority. Now, could someone say that a minimal facts argument appeals to what a majority or consensus of modern scholars think, and in that way it's confusing a sociological category, what some percentage of people think, with an evidential category, with evidence supports? And how would you respond to those who would view a minimal facts argument as being guilty of the fallacy of prevalent proof? Now, I think you already said, like, a love language thing. Maybe we can be conceding this for the sake of argument without actually saying this is, whatever they happen to believe is right. But go ahead, and how would you respond to that?
Yeah, well, the minimal facts argument is more than just appealing to what the majority say. That is not what the minimal facts, the only thing it does. The minimal facts, in order to be a minimal fact, you could say, it's got to meet two criteria. Number one, it's got to have strong supporting evidence. And number two, that evidence is strong, is verified or evidenced by the fact that a vast majority of critical scholars are willing to grant it as a fact. All right, so it's got to be those two things. It's number one, you got evidence for it. And number two, the majority of scholars is willing to grant that is a fact because of the evidence for it. So that's what the minimal facts argument has always been, at least the way I've understood it. And I always present evidence for it. Now, if I have to give an elevator speech, I'm in an elevator and I've only got, 1 minute, I might say, look, there's a lot of things we could discuss. I'll tell you what, let's just make this as simple as possible. Let me give you a couple of facts here that's so strongly supported by the data, which I'll be happy to give to you if you want it. It's so strongly supported by the data that the vast majority of even skeptical scholars are willing to grant them as facts. And why is this important? Well, it shows that I can build my case for it without assuming anything because I'm a biased Christian. So I'll take those facts, you formulate hypotheses, and I'll show that the resurrection hypothesis can explain those widely granted facts better than any other alternative. So that'd be my that'd be my elevator thing right there. But when I'm giving a lecture, of course I'm going to provide reasons to believe these facts and then say, hey, by the way, it's not just because I'm a Christian that believe these, even almost all skeptics believe these as well.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a good point. You're not just saying the agreement, because obviously what a majority of scholars say can vary over time quite significantly, but that would be validation versus this makes it true, but the evidence is what would make it true, and then we've got that as well. So
yeah, he
okay,
said to appeal to the majority without providing empirical evidence. And I know Habermas does it. I know I do it. So we always provide the evidence behind those facts. I
sure.
like the way that Paula Fredrickson, rather than minimal facts, I can understand minimal facts using that for apologetic purposes. As a historian, I prefer the term historical bedrock, which is one that Paula Fredrickson, not a believer, at Boston University, that's what she uses. And she says that the disciples believe that Jesus rose and appeared to them is part of historical bedrock, facts past doubting. That's kind of cool.
Sure. Yeah, historical bedrock, that is a good terminology.
Because you're building your case on that bedrock.
Sure. Now, as a Christian, I would think that the most important question about a historical bedrock apologetic or minimal fact apologetic would be whether, and I think you'd agree with this, of course, whether it's God honoring and a biblical method of defending the faith. Now, when I interact with unbelievers for the purpose of glorifying God and seeking to fulfill the Great Commission, I look at the model provided in the Gospels by Christ's interaction with unbelievers, at the model and Acts of the apostolic witness, the model in the Old Testament for preaching, stuff like that. I can see warrant in Scripture for doing things like proving from the Old Testament that Christ rose from the dead. I mean, they did that. That's all over the book of Acts. Psalm 16 says it, so it happened. And also for mentioning eyewitness accounts, Paul does that in 1 Corinthians 15. This may be a little bit more pushback question, but is there any positive pattern anywhere in the Bible where a biblical witness says something like, and again, I don't want to. So anyway, I'll state it. So does anybody ever say something like, "Don't worry about whether the Bible is inerrant or whether it has mistakes. Here are some minimal facts that are recognized by the overwhelming majority of the scholars every day, using those to prove the resurrection." And if we don't see that, would this be a biblical method of apologetics?
Um, I don't see it that's stated in that way. I mean, I don't imagine you're going to have an early Christian in the first century say, well, this is what all the scribes, how they're interpreting the Old Testament, and they're willing to say this about Jesus, you know. But I would take the reader to Acts 17, the latter part of it, when Paul is speaking at the Areopagus to the non-believers there. He doesn't even quote scripture, not once. He quotes their own poets. And he makes his points through quoting their own poets and then relating the gospel message to the message that's given through those poets. And he says, then God overlooked the times of ignorance, but now he furnished proof through raising his son from the dead. So it's not a minimal facts per se, but you wouldn't call it a means of preaching the gospel to non-believers using scripture.
Sure, yeah. And I mean, we don't know exactly everything Paul said in Acts 17, but it is interesting. It does definitely look like he did employ he did employ a different approach in the synagogue and on Mars Hill. That definitely is the case. Along
And what
the
does he
lines
say?
of
To a
that,
Jew, he became a Jew. To a Greek, he became a Greek that
yeah,
he may win some.
yeah. So you
I
could
have
say
never
maybe,
talked to a non-believer who said, and shared the evidence for the resurrection, and the non-believer turned around and said, I'm really surprised. You're really dishonoring the God in whom you believe. You know?
yeah, yeah. No, they definitely. I mean, they may not be knowledgeable enough to make an argument, but that's true. I've never heard anyone say that either. Yeah, that's they typically don't. That's true. That's definitely true. Along those lines, there's the whole thing. You know, you argue in the book that uh, the Gospels are like Greco-Roman biography. Um, do we actually we've got those quotations from in Act 17 from poets. We've got 1 Corinthians 15 appears to be another quotation from a classical source. Then we've got Titus, Epimenides. How would you respond to someone who said better background for the Gospels would be the Old Testament, which is quoted or alluded to thousands and thousands of times with direct quotations and then many many allusions, and the narratives there would be better background than a Greco-Roman biography genre, which is apparently never quoted in the New Testament at all. Why would we say that would be and obviously you wouldn't say the Old Testament's not crucial background, but why would we say that that genre would be important for us to understand how the New Testament is working if it's never even quoted or referenced anywhere?
I think that folks, that's a good question, Thomas. And I think folks can get really caught up in that Greco-Roman. Whoa, what's going on here? The reason they say Greco-Roman is because apart from four biographies written by Jews in the first century, three by Philo and one by Josephus, and Josephus's biography is an autobiography. And Philo, you've got Life of Moses, Life of, I think, Abraham, and Life of Joseph, I think. I might be wrong with that. And one of the Life of Moses. Aside from those four, Jews did not write biographies of their sages, not until modern times. So, and of the four biographies, three of them, and this is bracketing the Gospels, of course, three of those biographies written by Jews are just like the other biographies, like the lives of the 12 divine Caesars by Suetonius, or Plutarch's lives, the 48 that have survived. We know he wrote over 60, but 48 have survived. They're very much like it. And so it's like, since Jews did not write biographies of their sages other than his four, it's like Greco-Roman biography is the only game in town. That's why they call it Greco-Roman, not because there's something special about that differs from the Jews. So, I mean, you could just say, all right, you don't like the term Greco-Roman. I'm not saying it's you. I mean, maybe it is, but if you don't like the term Greco-Roman, just say ancient biography. All of these ancient biographies seem to be of the same sort, the same kind of quality, except the one of Philo that Philo wrote. Other than that, they're all pretty much the same in terms of following the rules, the same kind of conventions. So, you're going to illustrate the character of a person through certain deeds and things that they said and deeds that they did. They're all, for the most part, going to be around the same size, somewhere between 10 and 25,000 words. Sometimes they'll go beyond that. Like Josephus's autobiography, I think, is around 80,000 words. But of course, it's his autobiography, so he's got a lot more content that he knows about. But they're all usually around the same length. They they avoid, for the most part, the person's childhood. Because different from modern biographies that talk about how a person's character is developed over time through influences such as their social background and their education and their experiences, the ancients believed that a person was born with their particular character, and as they just aged, that character would come out more, but it didn't change. They were already determined to be that kind of a person. So anyway, there's so many different, there's so many different qualities. Richard Burridge lists like 10 qualities of Greco-Roman biography. Again, just call it ancient biography. And we see these for the most part in all these different biographies. So the genre of the Gospels is ancient biography. And so when you read the Gospels in view of its biographical genre, stuff like the deity of Christ, that even Mark, which I think was the earliest gospel, but even if you think Matthew was, still you see through Jesus's deeds and the things that he says illuminates who he is. He's God's uniquely divine Son, and that becomes even clearer when you read the Bible or you read the Gospels through its biographical lenses. And yes, it's got a Jewish flavor in it because at least two of the Gospels, probably three of them, are written by Jews. So you're going to have Jewish flavor behind it, but that doesn't do anything to call into question its biographical genre.
Okay. And it's interesting that I think in Against Appian, Josephus 1:8 through 10, I think he seems to denigrate pagan biographies there. Could someone argue that, and I don't know what, I was interested in Philo's there. Now, I don't know how much extra information Philo had about Moses or whatever, but it'd be interesting to hear what you say about how Philo did it differently. But what if somebody argued that a statement like that in Josephus or the Gospels and the Bible's claim to actually be infallible revelation would actually put them on a higher level than these biographies, so you can't necessarily assume that whatever would be acceptable to those would be acceptable in the New Testament or things like that. What would you say about that? That may be a big question.
Well, I don't think that the fact that the Gospels would be written in the genre of ancient biography would call into question its divine inspiration. I mean, all the literature of the Bible is written according to some kind of genre. Like you've got the historical books of the Old Testament, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. You've got the wisdom literature like Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs. You have letters like the letters of Paul and Peter. You've got a homily with Hebrews. You've got apocalyptic literature like Revelation, which reads a lot like First Enoch, and even Shepherd of Hermas has some stuff like that. And Fourth Ezra, that's apocalyptic literature. So it's not saying that it's not divinely inspired or anything like that. It's just saying all of the literature in the Bible falls into some sort of a known genre. So why would we think that the Gospels are going to be different in that sense? It's almost like a Mormon. You know, Mormons, I've heard them say on several occasions, when you bring up stuff, evidence against Mormonism, they'll say, well, the church has said you have to believe in spite of the evidence. Well, wait a minute. In the Old Testament, God kept saying to the Israelites, remember how I delivered you from the Egyptians. Remember how I brought plagues on them. Remember how I delivered you through the waters and drowned the Egyptians in it. Remember how I provided manna for you in the wilderness. Remember, remember, remember. You come to the New Testament and you look at the apostolic preaching. What are the apostles are saying? Hey, Jesus fulfilled prophecy. He performed miracles in your midst. He rose from the dead, and of that we are eyewitnesses, evidence. Now, all of a sudden, when it comes to Joseph and Mormonism, you say, well, God is going to deal in a completely different manner. You have to believe in spite of the evidence against Mormonism. Well, if all of the literature of the Bible falls into some category of genre, why do we think that the Gospels are exempt from that?
Okay. All right. Yeah, I don't know if it's exempt. Maybe I don't know how you define it. I mean, something being inspired would seem to could make a difference in how things are done. But we're kind of out of our time for right now. I would love to do a second part of this, but was there anything that you would like to say as a final? And I definitely appreciate taking your time. And even in our interview here, I appreciate the clear, careful study and hard work. Um, and even the honesty when something is coming up, like you said, well, I stand corrected. It's 14% instead of 7%, but you're definitely want to say what you're saying based on something substantial and based on evidence, and that is very commendable. That diligent scholarship and hard work. But anything you would like to say to kind of wrap up here for today?
Sure. Well, first, I'd like to say thank you for the interview. This has been delightful. And yeah, I might be wrong with some of these things. I mean, I don't think I am, of course, but I'm sure when I get to heaven, I'm going to get corrected on certain things. What I can say is I'm trying to be honest. I'm trying to look at Scripture. I love Scripture. I reverence Scripture because it's God's word. And I'm trying to read it and approach it as God meant for us to. And I could be wrong on some of my views. I'm sure I am. And you and I might disagree on some things, but you're a good brother. And these are things that would be secondary or tertiary issues. And I am totally fine with having disagreements with brothers and everything on tertiary and secondary issues. What's important to me are the essentials of the faith. I guess I'd close by saying that if Jesus rose from the dead, a lot of the other things that we have questions over that may bother us aren't so important. When I was really struggling with this back in the late 1980s, I remember calling Gary Habermas and saying, "Yeah, but what do you do with these alleged contradictions?" Well, Mike, we got answers to these things, but even if we're wrong on it, Jesus, if he rose from the dead, he did so before any of the Gospels were written. And so, even if the Gospels have some errors or contradictions in it, if Jesus rose, is Christianity true? Yeah. Okay. Well, Doc, there are a number of people, scholars out there that don't think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels, and we don't know who wrote them, they'll say. Well, Mike, we got some evidence that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels, but let's say that none of them wrote the Gospels. We still have four accounts of Jesus, even though we may not have known who wrote them. But let's just say, let's just say the Gospels are wrong on so many things. Do you have reason to believe Jesus rose from the dead? Yep, because we still have Paul's writings, and we can go back to the Jerusalem apostles through Paul on many occasions, and we can show Jesus rose that way. All right, Mike. Well, if Jesus rose and the Gospels are wrong on authorship, is Christianity still true? Yes. Why are you allowing it to bother you so much? And every objection I'd kind of bring up, he'd say, Mike, did Jesus rise from the dead? And that was a game changer for me, Thomas. It's like, if Jesus rose from the dead, it's game, set, match. Christianity's true, period. And that was a life changer for me. And it's like, yeah, I can struggle through some of these things, but Christianity's still true. And that gave me a freedom to look into these things without trying to say, well, I got to defend everything here, everything. It's either an all or nothing. No, it gave me a freedom to really look into this stuff and try to answer them as honestly as I could without having to kind of, well, I have to come to this kind of answer. Knowing that Jesus rose from the dead freed me from that.
Well, certainly true. The resurrection of Jesus Christ does change everything. I think it was that Muslim gentleman that converted to Christianity. I think it might have been at the debate that we talked about earlier. At the end, I think it was in his biography. He said, "Yeah, you may have the res. He might be right about the resurrection, but what about all? The Quran still has and is well, if you've got the resurrection, you do have everything." So yeah, it's going to be hard to come to any other conclusion than that Christianity is true if you got the resurrection. So, thank you for that. I appreciate your time very much, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day.